Okay, so what else do we need to know about Bitcoin? We know it's valuable because it's useful and it's scarce. We know that scarcity is necessary and nice, but not sufficient. Um, and we also know that money is an emergent, ground up phenomenon, right? You knew what money was before a professor told you what money was. The thing about that is it also makes it a bit of a dynamic phenomenon. The world history, we've seen all sorts of reserve currencies, all sorts of different monies, which is quite complicated and part of the whole emergent social phenomenon thing. So if we even think in our lifetimes, right, what's changed about money? You knew the U.S. dollar was money when you were a kid. If you were getting a quarter out of the payphone. Uh, how do you feel about quarters today versus when you were six? And it's not just because you have different financial decisions, right? Um, 20, 30 years ago, you could get a can of Coke with a quarter, at least in the U.S. You could play a round of an arcade game. You can't do either of those things now for that amount of cash. Uh, on a broader level, of course, a lot of other things are more expensive, right? College education is a lot more expensive, cars are more expensive, houses are more expensive, and there's all sorts of interesting tangents we can go into that. But the point is that the money that you remember as a kid is different today than it was then. Well, why? And part of money being this social phenomenon is that it's not this academic perfect system we described. Like, money is a system that humans agree on to answer the question of who gets what and why, which is another important and powerful question that you don't need a professor to explain to you, right? Like, you understood that question maybe before you were six and before you knew what a quarter was. Who gets what and why is also a political question. So that's another wrinkle to it and another important part of a social system like money. There's a political dimension, which means that there's a power dimension, there's a force dimension. If you can marshal a certain level of force and you feel like you don't have as much money as you would prefer, potentially you'd be able to invest the force you can marshal into more money. At least people have tended to think that way in the past. So if we look at this political complication of money and we look at, say, histories of civilizations, um, you always see different attempts to separate the use of violence from the value of money. Or at least, barring if you can't do that, at least attempts to make it seem like violence is never being used to determine the amount of money or to try to move money around or anything like that. Now, if you look at recent history, right, like that money has become worth less and less just from your childhood to today. That's quite recent, which is weird because the force backing that money might be higher. So maybe it's not just a force question. There's all sorts of other questions. Um, if you look further back and you say like, okay, well, the Romans used gold and silver, but eventually they needed to just clip parts of the coins off to raise more money, create the short-term illusion, be able to fabricate things, be able to get the value that money usually gets despite being a little short of what they would actually have for money. The problem is that people figure this stuff out, right? So governments are powerful entities that attempt to translate force into money always have to keep changing the game. You can't just do this and then like keep following the same plan because people figure it out and they'll start looking at coins and being like, well, this one's shaved so it's not worth the same, and you'll get all these other political concerns and whatever you're doing becomes less effective. Today, at least in most of the Western world, pretty much all of the world now, we've become much more sophisticated than physically cutting pieces of metal off of coins. Now we just have this thing called inflation, where effectively we're just printing money and devaluing currency all the time. And we don't have a gold standard anymore because that was inconvenient for the ability to just create money all the time. Now it's kind of weird that everybody's just okay with it. I remember learning about inflation, which again, you don't learn about inflation until like high school, right? You know that quarters are money when you're six. You don't learn about this top-down academic stuff until much later. And even then they talk about it like it's the weather, right? It's like, oh, well, inflation is this. It's like, oh, it's raining today. Inflation's 2%. It's never clear that inflation is an intentional thing. Inflation is something that is imposed by people with power on people without power. Now, much like ancient civilizations, we have all sorts of ways to dress it up, right? We have a whole class of priests that we call economists, and we even have a high priest that we call the chair of the Federal Reserve, and they wear the right robes, and they say the right things, and for the most part, people are like, yeah, like this is fine. We should have this. And it does work, as long as, your money system is still functioning, as long as force hasn't had to reach too far to make sure that the political things promised are still doing what they need to do. I don't want to get too much into like the potential negative consequences when people get this wrong, but you can just look through all human history and pretty much all the periods we associate with the rise and fall of civilizations are really just the rise being like the separation of force from money, and then the fall being like force coming back to money and value questions becoming more political. And you're always going up and down and up and down and up and down. What's interesting, at least with these pre-paper money civilizations, is that the power that's trying to manipulate money can fall, but if the money was based on precious metals or something like that, that can still be a valuable reserve currency for a long time. You've probably also heard of pieces of 8, for example, or doubloons, which continued to be valuable money, international money, long after the fall of the Spanish Empire. And that's because they were useful and because they were scarce. And in that case, too, because there wasn't a political power capable of skimming some of that value off. So you get these kind of unique windows in history. Where we're at now, of course, is a little bit different, but also a little bit the same. We still have force as a component. We still have politics as a component. We still have individual decisions as a component. It's not an academic exercise. It's this ground-up thing. So what are we supposed to do about all this, right? Like, we're not going to just take on large, powerful governments that have a monopoly on violence, a monopoly on money. And, gold and silver, I love gold and silver. They work. At the same time, they don't work, right? Like, governments have had the number on gold and silver for millennia. They know how to handle gold and silver. You can either be clipping coins, or you can just make it illegal, like FDR in the Great Depression, or you can confiscate it. Even today, people have it confiscated at airports all the time. So it'd be nice if we could have some sort of money that was more violence resistant than what we've been using in the past. Gold is great, silver is great. It has a certain level of violence resistance, but not that much, right? Like, it hasn't actually made it through large entities that control a lot of violence, despite being around for thousands of years. Bitcoin is an attempt to say, like, well, maybe if we make this digital and we try these properties and we have this type of community and we're working on it this way, maybe this could be more violence resistant, or violence resistant in a different way than what's come before it and what's already been defeated by various states or surpassed or devalued, what have you, right? So that's a little bit more on the social background of Bitcoin and some of the goals and some of the social backgrounds on money. I'll try to get more into the technical things of how Bitcoin does that. How is it useful? How is it scarce despite being digital? Which are also important what is Bitcoin questions. But I don't think you can get to that without thinking about the history and the social context and even where Bitcoin came from, right? It came right after the 2008 financial crash. The first block has a message about Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. And that's sort of how humans react, right? Like, when there are these certain problems, there becomes a higher incentive to find a solution. So given the current totally insane financial environment that we live in, right? Like, interest rates have been zero for going on a decade now. We had some massive crashes, things like cars and houses and college education. Like the US dollar, once the almighty dollar, is something of a joke, despite still, of course, having a lot of violence to back it up and a lot of other things to back it up. So Bitcoin's on the scene. It's also been around for about a decade, and we'll get into how it tries to solve some of the problems I've talked about in the next videos.